The radar operator's hand froze over the console as the blip appeared at the edge of contested airspace. Something was wrong. The signature didn't match any known aircraft in the theater, and it was moving with a confidence that suggested either supreme skill or catastrophic ignorance. Major Vincent Cray leaned forward in the operations center, his weathered face catching the green glow of the tactical display. 23 years of service had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every nerve in his body was screaming that this wasn't a routine intercept. The aircraft had appeared from nowhere, flying NOE, nap of the Earth, through a canyon system that most pilots wouldn't dare touch even in daylight. It was 0200 hours, moonless, the kind of darkness that swallowed mistakes whole. "Get me an ID," Cray ordered, his voice cutting through the murmur of the command center. The operator's fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling data from 3 separate reconnaissance satellites. Nothing. No transponder, no radio chatter. Just that single blip moving with surgical precision through terrain that had claimed 4 aircraft in the past 18 months. The major felt his jaw tighten. Either someone was testing new stealth technology, or they had a pilot with balls of titanium and a death wish to match. He reached for the secure line to scramble interceptors, then hesitated. Something about the flight path nagged at him. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't evasive. It was purposeful, following a route that suggested intimate knowledge of the mountain range's radar shadows and thermal patterns. "Sir, we're getting acoustic signatures now," another operator called out. "Single engine, light attack profile. Whoever this is, they're not running heavy ordnance." Cray studied the trajectory. The unknown aircraft was heading directly toward a fire base that had been taking sporadic mortar fire for the past 72 hours. Intelligence suggested enemy forces were using cave networks in the adjacent mountains, but reconnaissance flights had found nothing. Too dangerous, the brass had said. Too many surface-to-air threats. Too much risk for too little reward. Yet here was someone flying straight into the teeth of it, alone in the middle of the night, with a skill level that suggested they knew exactly what they were doing. The major made his decision and grabbed the radio handset. If this was one of theirs, he needed to know. If it wasn't, he needed to stop it. Either way, someone was about to have a very bad night, and he had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be the person in that cockpit. The radio crackled to static, then silence. Cray waited, his thumb hovering over the scramble authorization. The blip continued forward, steady, unwavering, impossible. He thought about the fire base, about the young soldiers taking cover from mortars, about the brass who'd written off the mission. Then he thought about the pilot, whoever they were, flying alone into hell with nothing but skill and nerve. He pressed transmit and spoke into the darkness, hoping someone was listening, hoping they were friendly. Hopping he wasn't about to make the biggest mistake of his career. The clock on the wall read 0213. Somewhere in those mountains, something extraordinary was about to happen, and nobody in the command center had any idea they were witnessing the beginning of a legend. The firebase's early warning system picked up the aircraft 3 minutes before Major Cray's transmission reached the pilot's headset. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had been on perimeter watch for 6 hours, his eyes burning from fatigue and dust, when the sound cut through the night. Not the whistle of incoming mortars. He'd learned to hate that particular music over the past 3 days, but something else. Something that made him freeze mid-step and cock his head toward the northern ridgeline. The sound was low, almost subsonic, the kind of engine note that spoke of deliberate throttle management and extreme low-altitude maneuvering. Webb had done 2 tours with the Army before washing out of air cavalry training due to a training injury, and he knew aircraft sounds the way other men knew their children's voices. This was someone flying on instinct, reading the terrain through feel rather than instruments. This was someone who shouldn't exist. "You hearing that?" Private Diaz whispered from the adjacent fighting position. Webb nodded, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his vest. Before he could key it, the night sky erupted. Not with explosions, but with the sudden appearance of navigation lights, red and green strobing through the darkness in a pattern that identified the aircraft as friendly. The pilot had waited until the last possible moment to announce themselves, staying dark through the approach to avoid drawing fire. Professional. Calculated. Webb felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The aircraft materialized like a ghost, a A-10 Thunderbolt II skimming so low over the firebase that he could feel the jet wash disturb the sand at his feet. The Warthog banked hard right, and in the brief illumination of the base's floodlights, Webb caught a glimpse of the tail markings. He knew that aircraft. More specifically, he knew the pilot, though he'd never met them. Everyone in theater knew about Reaper 64, the call sign that had become something between myth and inside joke over the past 18 months. The pilot who flew missions the brass wouldn't authorize. The one who'd racked up an impossible combat record while simultaneously earning more reprimands than any other aviator in the wing. The one everyone said was either the best stick in the Air Force or the luckiest fool to ever strap into a cockpit. Opinion was divided on which, and nobody seemed to know much about the actual person behind the call sign beyond rumors and hearsay. What Webb did know was that Reaper 64 had just violated about 14 different operational protocols by being here, and he'd never been happier to see military regulations torn to shreds in his life. The Warthog completed its orbit around the firebase, low enough that he could see the weapon's pylons loaded with precision ordnance, then climbed toward the ridgeline where intelligence estimated the mortar positions. Webb grabbed his radio and switched to the firebase command frequency, just as the aircraft's targeting pod swept the mountainside with infrared designation lasers. The pilot's voice came through the radio net, calm and measured, carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd been flying for hours. Tombstone Actual Reaper 64. I have eyes on 3 mortar positions bearing 345 degrees from your location, range 2,000 meters. Marked targets hot, requesting clearance to engage. The voice was distinctly feminine, which explained absolutely nothing about the skill on display, but confirmed one of the persistent rumors. The firebase commander's response crackled through almost immediately, surprise evident despite the professional tone. Nobody had requested air support. Nobody had expected it. Yet here it was, delivered by someone who'd apparently decided operational doctrine was more of a suggestion. The night lit up with the distinctive bark of the Warthog's GAU-8 Avenger cannon, 7 barrels rotating at 4,000 rounds per minute, delivering 30mm depleted uranium shells with surgical accuracy. Webb watched the tracers walk across the mountainside, each burst exactly where it needed to be, no wasted ammunition, no collateral damage. Just pure, devastating precision. Then the mortars fell silent, and for the first time in 72 hours, the firebase breathed easy. The Warthog pulled up and away, climbing into the darkness as efficiently as it had arrived, and Webb realized he'd been holding his breath. Whoever Reaper 64 was, they just saved lives while simultaneously ensuring they'd face a mountain of paperwork and probably another reprimand. Worth it, he thought. Absolutely worth it. In the command center 300 kilometers away, Major Cray listened to the engagement audio and felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't recklessness. This was something else entirely. The debriefing started at 0600 sharp, which gave Captain Nadia Kavar exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes of sleep after landing. She walked into the conference room knowing what waited. The same tired dance of justification and reprimand she performed more times than she could count. Colonel Patricia Hendricks sat at the head of the table, her expression carefully neutral, flanked by 2 officers Nadia recognized from wing operations. The flight recorder data was already loaded on the wall monitor, showing her approach vector through the mountain range in stark digital precision. Every violation cataloged, every risk immortalized in telemetry. Nadia set her helmet bag down and stood at attention, her flight suit still carrying the faint smell of jet fuel and adrenaline. She was 34 years old, compact and wiry in the way of people who'd learned to make efficiency a lifestyle. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her face bore the kind of tan that came from countless hours in a cockpit. Nothing about her appearance suggested exceptional ability, which had always worked to her advantage. Colonel Hendricks gestured to a chair, and Nadia sat, maintaining perfect military bearing despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. The colonel let the silence stretch for exactly 15 seconds, a power play Nadia had experienced enough times to recognize but not enough to become immune to. Finally, Hendricks spoke, her voice carrying the weight of command and something else, something that might have been respect or might have been frustration. Captain Kavar, would you care to explain why you decided to conduct an unauthorized combat operation in heavily contested airspace without clearance, backup, or apparently any concern for your own survival? The question hung in the air, and Nadia considered her response carefully. The truth was complicated. The truth involved a mentor who taught her that sometimes the rules existed to be broken when lives were at stake. The truth involved a call sign earned through blood and skill, and a reputation she'd built one impossible mission at a time. "Sir, the firebase was taking casualties," Nadia said, her voice steady. "Intelligence indicated mortar positions but classified the area as too high risk for standard air support. I assessed the situation and determined that a single aircraft approach using terrain masking and thermal camouflage had an acceptable probability of success. It was the sanitized version, the one that might keep her flying rather than grounded. It was also complete nonsense, and everyone in the room knew it. What she'd done was illegal, dangerous, and went against every principle of coordinated military operations. It was also exactly the kind of initiative that saved lives and won wars, which made it impossible to condemn outright. Colonel Hendricks studied her for a long moment, and Nadia met her gaze without flinching. "You violated 17 separate operational protocols," the colonel said quietly. "You flew without authorization into contested airspace. You engaged enemy targets without proper command clearance. You risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft and, more importantly, yourself, based on what appears to be pure instinct and arrogance." Each word was measured, precise, designed to cut. Nadia accepted them without reaction, had learned years ago that emotion was ammunition in rooms like this. Better to be stone, better to be ice, better to let the record speak for itself. "You also," Hendricks continued, and something shifted in her tone, "eliminated 3 enemy mortar positions with 0 collateral damage, saved an estimated 12 to 15 American lives, and demonstrated flight proficiency that I haven't seen in 20 years of service." The colonel leaned back in her chair, and for the first time, Nadia saw the ghost of a smile. "So here's my problem, Captain. I can't decide whether to ground you permanently or put you up for a medal. Help me understand who taught you to fly like that." The question struck deeper than any reprimand. Nadia felt her carefully maintained composure crack slightly, just enough to let through a flash of memory. A different airfield years ago. The smell of high desert and aviation fuel. A voice in her headset, patient and demanding in equal measure, teaching her that flying was more than mechanical skill, that it was art and science and instinct braided together until they became something transcendent. She'd been a lieutenant then, fresh from advanced training, cocky in the way of people who hadn't yet learned what they didn't know. The voice had belonged to Colonel Dimitri Vance, call sign Ghost, a pilot whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. He'd been a master of precision engagement, a sniper who happened to fly jets, and he'd seen something in her that others had missed. "I had an exceptional instructor, sir," Nadia said carefully, "Colonel Dimitri Vance. He taught me that sometimes the textbook is wrong, that mission success requires adapting doctrine to reality rather than forcing reality to conform to doctrine." She watched the recognition flash across Hendricks' face. Everyone in the Air Force knew about Ghost, the pilot who'd completed more danger-close support missions than anyone in history. The one who developed unconventional tactics that were studied in advanced flight schools but rarely implemented, because they required a level of skill most pilots simply didn't possess. The one who died 3 years ago when his aircraft took a direct hit during an extraction mission, staying on station until every soldier was safe before his damaged bird finally gave out. He'd been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, and his tactics had been quietly shelved as too risky for standard operations. "Colonel Vance," Hendricks repeated, and something in her expression softened. "That explains a lot, Captain. Ghost was notorious for finding pilots with natural talent and pushing them past every reasonable limit. He believed that the best aviators were forged through pressure and practical experience, not just classroom theory." The colonel paused, seeming to weigh her next words. "He also had a habit of ignoring regulations when he thought they interfered with mission success." "I see you learned that particular lesson well." It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't approval either. Nadia nodded once, accepting the observation. She'd spent 5 years under Vance's mentorship, learning to read terrain like a tactical map, to feel aircraft performance through her hands rather than instruments, to understand that precision wasn't about perfection, but about knowing exactly how much margin existed before failure. He'd been demanding to the point of cruelty, pushing her through scenarios that should have been impossible, breaking down her assumptions about what aircraft could do, and rebuilding them from first principles. The other officers in the room remained silent, letting the colonel control the conversation. Nadia knew they were documenting everything, building a case for whatever decision was coming. She'd been here before, standing at the intersection of competence and insubordination, trying to explain that sometimes the right thing to do and the authorized thing to do weren't the same. Most commanders couldn't reconcile that paradox. Most chose regulations over results, which was how soldiers died while pilots waited for clearance. Vance had taught her different, had shown her that the best military minds understood when to follow orders and when to exercise informed judgment, had given her a framework for making decisions in the chaos of combat that balanced risk against necessity, had essentially made her into the pilot she was today, exceptional, controversial, and impossible to ignore. "Captain Kavar," Colonel Hendricks said, pulling her back to the present, "I'm putting a formal reprimand in your jacket for unauthorized operations. This is non-negotiable and will remain part of your permanent record." Nadia felt her stomach drop slightly but maintained her expression. A formal reprimand was serious, potentially career-ending depending on how it was worded and who reviewed it. "However," the colonel continued, and Nadia's attention sharpened, "I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions last night. The Firebase commander's report was unambiguous. You saved lives through exceptional airmanship and tactical acumen. That matters more than protocol violations, at least to me." The colonel stood, and the other officers followed suit. Nadia rose as well, still processing the contradiction, reprimanded and decorated simultaneously. It was the most military response possible, acknowledging both the breach and the valor, filing the paperwork that would mark her as both problem and asset. "One more thing," Hendricks added as Nadia moved toward the door. "Stop flying alone. I don't care how good you are or who trained you. Next time you take a wingman, that's not a suggestion." Nadia nodded, saluted, and left the room, knowing she'd do exactly what the mission required regardless of what regulations said, just like Vance had taught her. The officers' club was mostly empty at 1700 hours, which suited Nadia fine. She sat at the bar nursing a single beer, still in her flight suit, processing the morning's debriefing and its contradictory outcomes. The bartender, a tech sergeant with 30 years of service written in the lines of his face, knew better than to make conversation. He'd been pouring drinks for combat pilots long enough to recognize when someone needed silence more than camaraderie. The beer was cold and forgettable, which made it perfect. Nadia wasn't drinking for taste. She was drinking because her hands needed something to do that wasn't gripping a control stick, and her mind needed something to focus on that wasn't aircraft performance envelopes and target acquisition. The weight of exhaustion pressed against her shoulders, the kind that came from flying on pure adrenaline and nerve for hours, then crashing back into reality with all its bureaucratic complications. "Your Reaper 6-4. The voice came from her left, stating fact rather than asking question. Nadia turned to find a captain she didn't recognize, another pilot judging by the wings on his chest, watching her with the mix of curiosity and skepticism she'd learned to expect. He was tall, probably former college athlete, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to prove yourself. His name tape read MITCHELL, and his eyes held the calculating assessment of someone trying to reconcile reputation with reality. "That's my call sign," Nadia confirmed, her tone neutral. She'd learned early that engaging with these conversations rarely ended well. Either they wanted to challenge her, prove she wasn't as good as the stories suggested, or they wanted to flirt, assuming the reputation was exaggerated and she needed their guidance. Both options exhausted her. "Heard you pulled some crazy stunt last night," Mitchell continued, sliding onto the stool next to her uninvited. "Flying solo through contested airspace, unauthorized strike, the whole 9 yards. Commands talking about grounding you permanently." He said it like he was sharing classified intelligence, like she wasn't intimately aware of every detail. Nadia took another sip of beer and said nothing. "I mean, I get it," he continued, warming to his monologue. "You want to prove yourself, show you can hang with the boys. But there's a reason we don't cowboy out there. It's dangerous. People get killed doing hero bullshit like that." The condescension dripped from every word, and Nadia felt the familiar anger coil in her chest. Not at the criticism, that was fair enough, even if wrong, but at the assumption. The automatic belief that her decision-making must be rooted in insecurity or showboating rather than tactical judgment. "3 American soldiers didn't die last night because of that hero bullshit," Nadia said quietly, still not looking at him. "The firebase took 0 casualties after I engaged those mortar positions. That's not proving myself. That's doing the job." She set her beer down with careful precision, the kind of control that suggested she was exercising significant restraint. Mitchell laughed, the sound carrying equal parts amusement and dismissal. "Come on, Kavar. You violated like 20 different regs. You could have gotten yourself killed. There's a reason we wait for proper authorization and coordinated strikes. It's called military discipline, not being a glory hound." The words hung between them, and Nadia felt the bar go quiet. Other pilots had noticed the exchange, were watching now to see how it played out. She could feel their eyes, their judgment, their predetermined conclusions about who she was and what motivated her. This was the price of being different, of being a woman in a combat aviation community that still wasn't entirely comfortable with that reality, of having a reputation that preceded her like a warning label. "You ever hear of Colonel Dimitri Vance?" Nadia asked, her voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. Mitchell's expression flickered with recognition. Everyone knew Ghost, even if they'd never flown with him. "I flew with him for 5 years. He taught me everything I know about precision engagement and tactical air support. You know what he said about waiting for authorization?" She finally turned to look at Mitchell directly, and something in her eyes made him lean back slightly. "He said that sometimes the enemy gets a vote, and if you wait for perfect conditions and complete approval chains, you're letting them write the terms of engagement. He said that the best pilots know when to ask permission and when to seek forgiveness, because the only unforgivable sin is letting people die while you're checking boxes." It was the most she'd said about Vance since his death, and the words carried weight that went beyond their tactical meaning. Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, then apparently thought better of it. Another pilot, a Major Nadia vaguely recognized from wing operations, stepped closer to the bar. "Vance trained you?" he asked, his tone completely different from Mitchell's condescension. There was respect there and curiosity and something that looked like understanding. Nadia nodded once. "He was my IP at Nellie's, then my squadron commander for 2 deployments. Everything I do in the cockpit traces back to him somehow." The major whistled low. "Then you're better than anyone in this bar, including me. Ghost didn't waste time on mediocrity. If he invested 5 years in training you, it's because he saw something exceptional." He glanced at Mitchell. "She's not cowboying. She's applying doctrine that most of us aren't skilled enough to execute. There's a difference." The validation felt strange, unexpected. Nadia had grown accustomed to defending herself, to having her competence questioned and her judgment scrutinized. Having someone understand, having someone recognize the lineage of her training, shifted something in the atmosphere. Mitchell had gone quiet, his earlier confidence deflated by the Major's casual dismantling of his assumptions. Ghost's tactics are studied but not taught anymore, the Major continued, settling onto a bar stool. Too risky for standard operations, requires too much natural ability, but they work when you have someone with the skill to pull them off. Sounds like last night proved that. He ordered a drink and turned to Nadia with genuine interest. What was it like training under him? I heard he was brutal. Nadia felt a small smile cross her face, the first genuine expression she'd worn since entering the club. Brutal is generous. He'd put you in impossible scenarios and expect you to find solutions that didn't exist. Then he'd show you that they did exist, you just weren't thinking creatively enough. He taught me to see aircraft as flexible tools rather than rigid platforms, to understand that every limitation is context-dependent. She could still hear Vance's voice in her head during complex maneuvers, that calm Russian-accented drawl talking her through problems faster than her conscious mind could process them. He'd been a demanding teacher because he'd understood that mediocrity in combat aviation meant death, yours or someone else's. He'd pushed her past fear, past doubt, past the comfortable boundaries of standard doctrine, until flying became something more than mechanical skill. It became intuition, reflex, art. He used to say that the best pilots were like snipers, Nadia continued, surprised at herself for sharing. That every trigger pull, every weapon's release, every maneuver had to be exactly right because there were no second chances at that level of precision. One mistake, one moment of hesitation or sloppiness, and people died. So you trained until mistakes became impossible, until your hands knew what to do before your brain finished forming the thought. The bar had gone completely quiet now, other pilots listening with the attention usually reserved for mission briefings. This was insider knowledge, tactical wisdom from a legend, filtered through someone who'd actually learned at his feet. That's why you fly alone, the Major said, understanding dawning. Not because you're arrogant or reckless, but because the tactics require a level of precision that's hard to coordinate with a wingman. Ghost flew alone too, most of the time. Nadia nodded. Coordinating with another aircraft means compromising on speed, approach vectors, response time. For standard operations, that's fine. But for high-risk precision work, especially in complex terrain, sometimes solo is actually safer. You're only managing one variable set, your own performance. It sounded like justification when spoken aloud, and maybe it was. But it was also truth, the kind that came from hundreds of hours in the cockpit learning exactly what she and her aircraft could do together. Mitchell had recovered enough to interject. That's all great in theory, but military operations are built on teamwork. Nobody's good enough to lone wolf it indefinitely. He wasn't entirely wrong, which made the observation more frustrating. You're right, Nadia admitted, finishing her beer. Which is why I follow standard doctrine 90% of the time. Fly with the squadron, run coordinated strikes, integrate with the larger mission structure. But that other 10%, when conventional approaches won't work and lives are on the line, I do what Vance taught me. I adapt. She stood, suddenly tired of the conversation, tired of defending choices she'd make again without hesitation. The Major nodded his understanding, while Mitchell still looked skeptical but at least had stopped with the patronizing routine. For what it's worth, the Major said as she prepared to leave, I read the after-action report from last night. Staff Sergeant Webb, one of the soldiers at that fire base, wrote that he'd never seen flying like that outside of airshow demonstrations. Said you put every round exactly where it needed to be with zero margin for error. That's not luck. That's mastery. Nadia felt something warm in her chest, a validation that mattered more than medals or reprimands. Webb had been there, had seen what she'd done in context. His opinion carried weight that armchair analysts could never match. She left the officers' club as the sun set over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. Up there, above the clouds and complications, things made sense. Physics was honest. Aerodynamics didn't care about your gender or your reputation, or whether you followed every regulation precisely. Either you understood how to make metal and thrust defeat gravity, or you didn't. Either you could put ordnance on target while managing a dozen variables simultaneously, or you couldn't. The rest was noise, human politics that mattered in conference rooms but evaporated the moment you strapped into a cockpit and pointed your nose at the sky. Nadia walked back to her quarters thinking about Vance, about the lessons he'd beaten into her through repetition and impossible challenges, about the legacy he'd left in the pilots he'd trained. She was one of a dozen, maybe fewer, who'd survived his program and emerged genuinely transformed. Most washed out. Some became competent but never exceptional. A few, like her, became something else entirely. Pilots who could do things that looked like magic but were really just the application of principles most people never fully internalized. 3 days later, Nadia found herself back in the briefing room for mission planning. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Reeves, stood at the front reviewing a tactical map of the northern sector. Reaper 64's unauthorized strike had apparently opened some eyes in the intelligence community. Reconnaissance satellites had picked up increased activity in the mountain range she'd engaged, suggesting a larger enemy presence than previously estimated. Now Command wanted proper surveillance and potential strike packages, which meant coordinated squadron operations rather than solo adventures. Nadia sat toward the back, her notebook open, listening as Reeves outlined the mission parameters. Standard recon sweep, multiple aircraft, staggered approach vectors to maintain coverage without clustering. It was textbook execution, safe and professional and exactly what she'd expected. It was also going to be obvious to anyone watching, which meant the enemy would likely go to ground before they gathered useful intelligence. "Captain Kavar," Reeves called, pulling her attention front. "Since you have recent familiarity with the terrain, I'm putting you on the initial sweep. You'll fly with Captain Mitchell as your wingman." Nadia felt her jaw tighten but kept her expression neutral. Mitchell, who 3 days ago had been lecturing her about not being a glory hound. This was either Reeves' idea of building team cohesion or subtle punishment for her unauthorized mission, possibly both. "Sir," she acknowledged, making eye contact with Mitchell across the room. He looked about as thrilled with the arrangement as she felt, which at least meant they were starting from equal misery. The rest of the briefing covered standard operational details, communication protocols, fuel management, engagement rules, emergency procedures. Nadia had heard it all 1,000 times, could recite it in her sleep. What interested her more was what Reeves wasn't saying. The gaps in the intelligence picture that suggested they were flying partially blind into an area that had already proven hostile. After the briefing, Mitchell caught up with her in the hallway. "Look," he started, and Nadia braced for whatever apology or justification was coming. "I was out of line at the bar. The major explained some things about Vance's training methods, and I did some reading. I didn't understand what you were doing or why." It was as close to genuine contrition as she was likely to get from him, delivered with the awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to admitting error. "Understood," Nadia said simply, not particularly interested in drawing out the moment. "For tomorrow's mission, just follow standard formation protocol. Stay on my wing, maintain calm discipline, and we'll be fine." Mitchell nodded, then seemed to wrestle with whether to say more. "That precision flying you did during the unauthorized strike, can you teach that, or is it just natural talent?" The question surprised her with its earnestness. "Both," Nadia admitted. Vance used to say that about 10% of pilots have the natural spatial awareness and reflexes necessary for extreme precision work, but raw talent only gets you maybe 20% of the way there. The rest is training, repetition, learning to read situations faster than conscious thought. Anyone can improve, but not everyone can reach the highest levels. It was honest without being discouraging, the same answer Vance had given her years ago when she'd asked the same question. "Would you be willing to run some training exercises after this deployment?" Mitchell asked. "Share some of those techniques with the squadron. If Command's going to start running missions in terrain like what you navigated, it seems like everyone would benefit from understanding the principles." Nadia studied him for a moment, trying to determine if this was genuine interest or an attempt to undermine her unique position. His expression suggested the former, which was almost more uncomfortable than hostility. Being seen as a resource rather than an aberration meant responsibility, meant acknowledging that her skills might actually matter to other people's survival. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Let's see how tomorrow's mission goes first." They parted in the hallway, and Nadia continued toward the flight line, her mind already running through the next day's profile. Flying with a wingman again after so many solo operations would require adjusting her instincts, accounting for another aircraft's position and capabilities, accepting that she couldn't maneuver with quite the same freedom. It wasn't bad necessarily, just different, and difference required attention. The morning broke clear in cold, perfect flying weather. Nadia completed her pre-flight inspection with habitual thoroughness, running hands along control surfaces, checking weapons mountings, verifying that every system read nominal. Her Warthog sat on the tarmac like a particularly ugly but reliable workhorse, all function with zero concern for aesthetics. She'd flown this specific aircraft for 18 months now, knew its quirks and tendencies, could feel through the stick when it was running slightly hot or when the hydraulics needed attention. Aircraft and pilot had become extensions of each other, which was exactly how Vance had taught her it should be. Mitchell appeared from around the nose of his own bird, giving her a thumbs up that she returned. Whatever awkwardness existed on the ground would disappear once they were airborne. Flying demanded focus that crowded out personal dynamics, reduced communication to essential mission data, made everything simple again through the clarity of immediate purpose. "Reaper 6-4, Reaper 6-5, you're cleared for departure," the tower controller's voice came through her helmet. Nadia advanced throttles and felt the familiar press of acceleration, the moment when the aircraft transitioned from earthbound metal to something more essential. The Warthog lifted off with its characteristic grace, which was to say none at all, but with absolute reliability. She climbed to pattern altitude with Mitchell maintaining proper formation position off her right wing, exactly where he should be. So far, so good. They proceeded north toward the mission area, the morning sun painting long shadows across the desert below. At this altitude, the world looked peaceful, almost beautiful. The mountains rose ahead, their peaks catching early light, giving no indication of the violence hidden in their valleys. Nadia checked her tactical display, confirming the planned route that would take them through a series of reconnaissance waypoints. Standard procedure called for maintaining altitude and using sensors to scan for activity, staying above the effective range of most portable surface-to-air weapons. But Nadia had flown this terrain 3 days ago, knew that the interesting activity was all hidden in thermal shadows and cave networks that wouldn't show up on high-altitude scans. She toggled her radio to Mitchell's private channel. 6564. Recommend we drop to low altitude for the sweep. Better sensor resolution, and we can check the locations I engaged during the previous strike. There was a pause before Mitchell responded, and she could imagine him weighing doctrine against practical results. 6-4, that's outside the mission parameters. We're supposed to maintain altitude and avoid unnecessary exposure. He was right, technically. He was also going to miss everything important if they stuck to the plan. Your call, Nadia said, keeping her tone neutral. But the firebase took mortars for 3 days before I found those positions at low altitude. High-level reconnaissance missed them completely. We can play it safe and come back with nothing useful, or we can actually gather intelligence worth analyzing. Another pause, longer this time. Nadia could almost hear Mitchell's internal debate, duty versus effectiveness, following orders versus following the pilot who'd proven her judgment 3 days ago. Fine, he said finally, and she heard resignation mixed with determination. We go low, but the second things look dicey, we're back to altitude. Agreed. Nadia smiled inside her oxygen mask. Agreed. Follow my lead and stay alert for ground threats. She pushed her stick forward and dropped toward the mountains, feeling Mitchell match her descent. The terrain rose to meet them, and suddenly they were threading through valleys instead of floating above them, close enough to see individual rocks and vegetation patterns. This was where flying became art, where understanding airflow and terrain interaction separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Nadia felt her awareness expand, taking in a dozen variables simultaneously: altitude, airspeed, terrain features, threat vectors, fuel state, weapons status, Mitchell's position, emergency egress routes. Each factor existed in her consciousness as a separate thread while simultaneously forming a complete tactical picture that updated continuously. This was what Vance had trained into her. This ability to process complexity without being overwhelmed by it, to maintain situational awareness that encompassed everything relevant while filtering out everything that wasn't. They rounded a ridge and the valley opened before them, exactly as she remembered from 3 nights ago. Except now, with daylight and better angles, she could see more detail. Disturbed earth near cave entrances, tire tracks suggesting vehicle traffic, the unmistakable signature of a logistics operation trying to hide in terrain too remote for routine surveillance. 6-5, you seeing this? Nadia transmitted, keeping her aircraft in a gentle bank to maximize sensor coverage. Affirmative, Mitchell replied, and she heard new respect in his voice. This is definitely a staging area. How the hell did high altitude